In the year 1400, Florence was a city at the center of the world, commercially, artistically, and politically. The wool trade flowed through it. The Arno River made it a junction point for goods moving across Europe. And at the heart of this city's financial life sat a collection of banking families who had discovered, centuries before the word became fashionable, the power of leverage. Among these families, one would rise above all others. One family would not merely accumulate wealth. It would accumulate the architecture of power itself. It would become the primary banker to the papacy. It would fund kings and queens across Europe. It would place its own members on the papal throne, not once, but twice. And in doing so, it would effectively purchase an era, transforming a city and an age through the raw application of money, ambition, and strategic patience. This is the story of the Medici, and what they understood about power that most people still don't. The Medici Bank was formally established by Giovanni de' Medici in 1397. But to understand what made it different from every other banking operation in Florence at the time, you need to understand the legal environment it was born into. The Catholic Church officially prohibited usury, the charging of interest on loans. This was not merely a moral position. It was enforced doctrine. A banker who charged interest was, in the eyes of the Church, committing a sin. And in 14th and 15th century Florence, the Church's judgment was not metaphorical. Excommunication was a tool with real teeth. The Florentine banking families had developed a workaround, elegant in its simplicity. Instead of charging interest on loans, they conducted transactions in foreign currencies and took their profit from the exchange rate, a spread that was functionally and mathematically identical to interest, but could be classified as a currency service rather than a loan. The sin was the same. The semantics were different. The Church, which had its own financial needs and depended heavily on these banking families, was willing to accept the semantics. Giovanni de' Medici took this system and scaled it. He didn't just build a bank. He built a networked banking system, a series of semi-autonomous branches in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London, each structured as a separate legal partnership. This structure was not merely administrative convenience. It was risk management. If one branch failed, the liability did not automatically contaminate the others. The Medici had, in effect, invented a rudimentary version of the limited liability structure that would not become standard commercial practice for centuries. The Rome branch was the crown jewel. The papacy required a banker, someone to collect Peter's pence from across Christendom, to manage the transfer of funds between the Vatican and its far-flung operations, to finance the Church's considerable political and military activities. Giovanni secured this relationship early, and it became the financial engine of everything that followed. It was Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, who transformed a wealthy banking family into the dominant force in Florentine politics. Cosimo understood something that separates merely rich people from truly powerful ones. Money is a tool, not a destination. The point of accumulating financial resources was to translate them into durable influence that persisted beyond any individual transaction or relationship. He did this through a practice that would today be recognized as sophisticated stakeholder management. Cosimo did not parade his wealth. He dressed modestly. He avoided the overt displays of magnificence that characterized other wealthy Florentines. He built a reputation as a man of the people, even as he quietly and systematically made the entire city financially dependent on him. The mechanism was loans. Cosimo made loans to influential Florentines, merchants, guild leaders, prominent families, at favorable terms. He did not press aggressively for repayment. This generosity was not altruism. Each outstanding loan was a thread of dependency, a relationship in which the borrower had a permanent interest in Cosimo's continued goodwill and political survival. A man who owes you money is not merely a debtor. He is an ally. Cosimo built an entire political network out of this principle. When his political enemies managed to have him exiled from Florence in 1433, using the legal apparatus of the city's councils, Cosimo simply waited. Within a year, The economic consequences of his absence had become too painful for the city to sustain. His banking relationships, his international trade connections, his ties to the papacy, all of it started to fray the moment he left. Florence needed him more than he needed Florence. He returned in triumph in 1434, and his enemies were themselves exiled. He never held formal political office for most of his life. He didn't need to. The machinery of the city ran according to his preferences because the people who operated that machinery were financially entangled with him. This is what historians mean when they call Cosimo the power behind the throne, not as a metaphor, but as a precise description of how political control operated in Renaissance Florence. The Medici relationship with the papacy reached its apex with the elevation of two Medici family members to the pontificate. Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, son of the magnificent Lorenzo de' Medici, became Pope Leo X in 1513. The story of his election is illustrative. Giovanni was not the most devout candidate, nor the most theologically accomplished. He was, however, the best connected, the most financially capable, and the product of a family that had spent a century cultivating relationships with every cardinal in Rome. When the conclave assembled, the outcome was, in the language of modern political analysis, over before it began. Leo X is perhaps best remembered for two things: his extravagant spending, which helped bankrupt the Vatican treasury, and his decision to expand the sale of indulgences, certificates of spiritual remission sold to the faithful, to raise funds for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. It was this decision, specifically the hawking of indulgences by a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel in German territories, that provoked an obscure Augustinian monk named Martin Luther to nail 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. The Medici Pope's financial decisions, in other words, triggered the Protestant Reformation. The ripple effect of one family's financial management of the Catholic Church would divide Western Christianity permanently and reshape the political map of Europe for the next 3 centuries. Giulio de' Medici, Leo's cousin, became Pope Clement VII in 1523. His papacy was defined by the catastrophe of the sack of Rome in 1527, when troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ironically, men fighting on behalf of a monarch the Medici had helped finance, pillaged the city for weeks in one of the most brutal urban devastations of the Renaissance era. The cultural legacy of the Medici is impossible to disentangle from the financial mechanisms that produced it. Lorenzo de' Medici, called Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, ran one of the most sophisticated patronage operations in history. He maintained in his household or under his active sponsorship a roster of artists, poets, philosophers, and architects that reads like a greatest hits of the Italian Renaissance. Sandro Botticelli painted under his direct patronage. A teenage Michelangelo Buonarroti was invited to live in the Medici Palace and dine at the family table, his education funded and his early career shaped by Lorenzo's support. Leonardo da Vinci received his first significant commission through Medici connections. The Platonic Academy of Florence, a gathering of Renaissance humanists, devoted to recovering and debating the works of Plato and the ancient Greeks, was founded and funded by Cosimo de' Medici. It was here, in rooms that exist because a banker decided to spend money on philosophy, that the intellectual framework of the Renaissance was assembled. The rediscovery of classical texts, the revival of Neoplatonic thought, the integration of pagan philosophy with Christian theology, all of it was seeded by Medici money. The Uffizi Gallery, which today houses one of the most important collections of Renaissance art in the world, began as a Medici administrative building. The Boboli Gardens, the Medici Chapels, the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. The physical landscape of Florence is, to a remarkable degree, a monument to the spending priorities of one banking family. The Medici Bank itself began to decline in the final decades of the 15th century, undone by a combination of overexpansion, bad loans to European monarchs who defaulted, and the management failures of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was a brilliant political operator but a less careful banker than his grandfather had been. The bank formally collapsed in 1494, The same year French troops under Charles VIII invaded Italy, and the Medici were expelled from Florence for the first time. It was an ignoble end for an institution that had, at its peak, been the largest and most sophisticated banking organization in Europe. But to measure the Medici by the fate of their bank is to miss the point entirely. Banks are temporary. The art they commission has lasted 500 years. The architectural traditions they funded shaped Western buildings for centuries. The philosophical frameworks their academies developed formed the intellectual foundation of the modern world. Two members of the family sat on the throne of Christendom. Their descendants married into the royal families of France and England. The Medici understood, intuitively, something that eludes most wealthy people. The highest return on capital is not financial. It is civilizational. Money spent on art, philosophy, architecture, and education compounds differently than money kept in a vault. It compounds in time, in cultural influence, in the permanence of ideas. They bought the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is still paying dividends.